Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am here in the IDA offices today for the first time in over a year. I am so excited. Hopefully next time it can be in the theater next year, next program. But my name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events here at the International Documentary Association. I wanted to, before we begin, I want to offer a land acknowledgement as we always do. As I said, I'm coming to you from the IDA offices here in Los Angeles, which is on the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would also like to offer thanks to our sponsor, Variety, for helping to bring this series to us this year. We're really excited to have them on board. And we're gonna get started with this amazing conversation around Showtime's Belushi. We have Joe Neumaier here, who's gonna get us started. Welcome, Joe. Oh, and before we start, I want to offer thanks to Andrea. I've forgotten to thank you before in the past, so thank you so much for all you do with us and your interpreting services. We're very grateful. Joe, it's all yours. Oh, you're muted. It's a year into the pandemic and we still are all doing it.
Hopefully we'll go back to live stuff really soon. Thank you, Cassidy. And hello, everyone. I'm Joe Neumaier, film critic for New York's WOR Radio. And thank you for joining us for this panel for the International Documentary Association's Emmy Award Spotlight Series panel on Belushi, an extraordinary documentary on Showtime about the man whose name really defines a generation and an era, not just for comedy, but for American culture. It's an honor to introduce the film's writer, producer, and director, R.J. Cutler, and Judy Belushi-Pisano, writer, graphic artist, manager for many of the shows John Belushi was involved in, and whose archives, films, photos, interviews, and personal recollections made the film possible. Thank you, and welcome to you both. Congratulations on the film, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. And I don't see myself.
Yeah, RJ, talk to us about the genesis of the film, because it truly takes us through John Belushi's life and career, through the reminiscences of those who knew him and loved him and worked with him, thanks to more than 50 hours of audio tapes. The intimacy of the voices really guide this story. How did you see it from the beginning?
Well, I saw it as an opportunity to come to understand the remarkable life and work of John Belushi, and an effort to understand the man as fully and his times. And the opportunity came to me because of my partnership with John Batzik, my producing partner on the film. He and I had just finished producing Listen to Me, Marlon, the film about Marlon Brando, and we're talking about what project we might do next. And he mentioned to me that he had been courting Judy Belushi for the better part of a decade in an effort to persuade her to grant him permission to make a film about John. And though Judy had, of course she can of course speak for herself, but though she had resisted his many charms over the better part of that decade, John felt that perhaps the time would be right, given the Brando film, which we could send her, and my interest in directing the film to get her blessing. And Judy, what do you have to say about all that?
I say it's all true. And it was quite funny, actually. John would call me every year for 10 years. And I had met with him early on, but I really didn't want to do one at that point. I was in my second marriage and raising children, and I just didn't feel that it was the time. But he was charming, and he kind of convinced me to not say no. So I said, I'll tell you what, why don't you talk to my brother-in-law? And that was a little bit of a setup, because unless I told Jimmy I really, really wanted to do it, he was not gonna, he said, you really want to do it? I said, nah, not right now. So they met, and I guess Jimmy just sort of got in John's face and was like, what do you know about comedy? What are the 3 rules of humor? And John just said, I don't know, but I would find out. It's important, I'll find out. But anyway, years later, it all came back together.
Yeah.
And when Judy did agree to let us make the film, the first thing she did was invite us up to Martha's Vineyard to get to know each other a little bit, and that really was a special few days, because Judy not only fed us, but she invited us into her the basement of her home in Martha's Vineyard, the home she's in now, and where her personal archive of John's life and work resided, and she was kind enough to let us kind of dig through it, and it was there that we discovered these boxes of audio tapes that she and some others had collected over time for the potential oral history, but also we discovered John's letters that he had written throughout his life that play such a key role in the film, and are read in the film by the brilliant Bill Hader, and this treasure trove of imagery, of photographs, and so many other things. So that provided the foundation for being able to tell the story in the way that we did.
Yeah. Judy, the film really illuminates so many things about John that I think people sort of either have forgotten over the years or perhaps never knew. And one of them is that how crucial his blue collar background was, his father's immigrant status was, his Midwesternness, for lack of a better phrase, that really sort of formed the basis for his performances and for his life as an artist. That's really something that the film really gets right, and that's something that was so prevalent and so important to him from the beginning, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was a working class hero.
Yeah.
And, he found his way through gut and determination and talent and hard work. He, fought lots of obstacles, had a lot of challenges, and, stayed true to his heart. I mean, John was really more an artist. He was an entertainer. That was perhaps his grandest talent, but he was an artist. He had a whole palette that he used. And, he saw things a little differently than some actors or entertainers. It was really important that it was what he thought was the right way to be. He really didn't like doing things he was uncomfortable with. And I think that's important when you're an actor.
Yeah.
I mean, you might want to go out of your comfort zone. That's different. But when you're doing something that just doesn't feel honest. I remember in college, he was the lead in a play, and he quit because he just didn't like the director and where it was going. And he kept, at first he was arguing with him, and then I remember he said, "I'm going to quit." And I thought, you can't quit, He said, I'm not going to go do something when it's so wrong. I'm not going to stand up there and do that,
Yeah.
Judy describes that in the film as John Belushi 101, and it really informs what I think one of the fundamental revelations of the film is, which is that John wasn't just a comedian. He was or an actor, and indeed he was an artist, but I say most of all, he was a visionary. He was the visionary who brought this group of remarkable performers together. He basically, to crisscross two countries in search of them, and found a bunch of them up in Toronto, a bunch of them in New York, a bunch of them in Chicago, but brought them all together in the days of the National Lampoon Radio Hour, and refined them as a troupe. And I can't tell you, I'm sure this won't surprise Judy, how many people just throughout John's life described this phenomenon. When you invite John Belushi to come to be somewhere, he'll show up with 9 other people, and no matter what it was, whether it was in high school doing the sketch comedy, or with if his band showed up, or if you cast him in a play, and then throughout his life, he'd always show up with a gang. And that's what a director does. A director gathers people and puts on a show, and that's what John did. And for all the triumph of Lorne Michaels' vision and execution, and the decades of brilliance that Saturday Night Live has demonstrated, the simple fact of the matter is the original not ready for primetime players were gathered first and refined as a troupe by John Belushi, and we tell that story in the film, and you see it, and it's a quite beautiful thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, his energy is so, it's said in the film several times, but it's very infectious. That sort of sense of, if John is feeling it, that people will kind of catch on to that feeling and really kind of ride that wave of love or bonhomie or enthusiasm he has for something, right, Judy? That was really
Very
such
much.
a prevalent part of it. Yeah.
He had a very powerful energy, I reflect on this at times, and that it was so powerful, it's still resonating with me because he was so close to me. I mean, it's really powerful. And as it does with other people in a different way, though, you know, but I think he was just very powerful. So when he was happy and upbeat, he took the room with him. And then likewise, if he was, you know, feeling down or angry, that was overpowering too.
Yeah. RJ, we've spoken about how one of the things that was a bit of a revelation for you in some ways in terms of as the film was coming together was that anything John did, he wound up conquering, even going back to football when he was in school, that sort of sense of, even from the beginning, there was this sense of he would kind of set out to do something and do it. And that sort of, that largesse of spirit kind of, it kind of made him indomitable in a lot of ways and really a force of nature, wasn't it?
Well, it's definitely true, but I think it went hand in hand with his restless spirit. He was, you know, in the months since we've released the film, when I do press, I'm often asked if John Belushi were around today, and of course that's a question you can't answer. What would he be doing? But I do know this: he would be pushing himself into new areas, because if you look at his life, that's the definition of his work. He was always pushing himself into new areas, often into the unfamiliar, often into the risky. And it was, it certainly he had the spirit of as you say, an indomitable spirit, but, and he was a perfectionist in many ways. But he was always stretching himself. He was always trying new things. I mean, goodness, the Blues Brothers it's performance art a full decade before performance art is a thing. It's, you know, and it's part of what's so thrilling about watching the Blues Brothers. And the reason we open the film with that performance at the Universal Amphitheater is that it inspired such the giddy kind of joy, like you didn't know how to respond. You were laughing, but it wasn't comedy. You were thrilling at the music, but it wasn't just music. It was something that transcended so many different traditional categories. And you see the audience kind of in this euphoric state. And that was what John Belushi, that's what early Saturday Night Live meant to so many of us. That's what the Blues Brothers meant. That's what Animal House meant. He always was able to somehow elevate whatever his performance was, whatever the thing that he was doing was, to a level that hadn't been experienced before. And it was indeed thrilling.
Yeah, from those massive amphitheater performances to a 4-minute sketch to the beauty of Continental Divide, which I think is just one of the most beautiful and subtle and sublime performances of the 1980s. I really I'm such a fan of that movie. Judy, you're heard in the film. There's a quote that I love in the film where you say that John was more fragile than a lot of people who appeared more fragile. And I love that. I think it's echoed in Robert Valley's beautiful animation in the film that often juxtaposes the adult John with the eager little boy in Wheaton, Illinois, knocking on people's doors. I think that's an important part of the film too, is John's vulnerability, which fueled a lot of his performances and made us feel them in many ways, right?
Yeah, definitely. I like to think, his various performances all really, the four main ones captured really important parts of him. Bluto being the sort of sloppy party guy, and Jake being the cool, dark side, and Neighbors being the kind of uptight guy that he was and could be, and then Continental Divide sort of being that reader, the more intellectual city kid.
Yeah.
And his vulnerability, though, he was very fragile. I mean, he was in certain ways. I mean, he was very sensitive. His feelings actually got hurt very easily, and he was a big guy, so he cut of spirit.
Right.
He kind of buried it or covered it up, but at times it would come out. You'd be, I mean, people made him cry sometimes just by being mean,
Yeah.
I don't think you can be an artist performing at that level without enormous vulnerability. And And the connection to the childhood John that you're referencing in Robert's beautiful work in the animation was a major breakthrough in the film. It wasn't like we were struggling. It just was like when Robert first showed me the cells that would become the animation of young John knocking on the neighbor's door at 3.5 years old to come inside and give a performance in the neighborhood. And I saw that little boy. I was like, well, that boy's got to be there throughout the entire film. And as we identified moments where he would show up, critical moments in John's life, it just deepened the resonance because we're all the kid we were then. We're all connected in that way. And but John's, his connection to his true self is part of what made him so remarkable, and his willingness to share that, to be vulnerable in that way, is what in many ways made him the artist he was.
Yeah. And Judy, that's also part of he would always see things new, right? He would always see fresh ways of looking at things. That was part of his viewpoint in some ways, kind of connecting to that childlike sense of wonder, right?
Yeah. I often said before, this, that I think because of my experience with John, I realized an artist sees things with a child's eyes. They're, and John was sort of that way. See it fresh. You see it anew, and sometimes that can lead to interesting observations, but it can also lead to a funny one.
Yeah, and also, children. There's a lot of talk about appetite. There's a lot of talk about excess, and these are childlike characteristics as well. There's complexity that comes. I'm now the dad of 3, and we added another Judy since last I saw you.
I saw that.
And so it's amazing. But you see that, and to be in touch with that, on some important level, it's all a parent wants is for their kids to be able to maintain contact with that right. True essence that forms and that at that young age. And John brought it all. He brought it all.
I think maybe also holding on to that childlike quality perhaps opens you to some childish behavior as well. You might get your lines blurred at times.
No, that's interesting. You're right. And RJ, as with the tapes, John's letters to Judy, the film could never have been made, I would imagine, without them, because they connect them to his and Judy's relationship, their beautiful love story in such a profound way. Those letters and John's poetry to her are so emotional and are so universal in many of the issues and struggles that he's discussing in those letters, aren't they?
Well, of course. And it's listen, one of the fundamental challenges of making this film is that John's life was lived in during a time when we all didn't have cameras in our pockets. There were no smartphones. There wasn't a ton of home movies. And he was a very private man. He was, people forget, but let's see. Saturday Night Live launched in 1975. People magazine launched in 1974. This was not a celebrity culture in that time. Celebrities were not expected to vomit up every aspect of their lives to anybody who asked. There was no John Belushi, Barbara Walters interview for us.
He was asked.
He was there.
He said that she said, when he said no, she called her himself and said, "Oh, please, please, please."
So instead, they just made fun of her on Saturday Night Live. But we didn't have that to rely on or to mine. But what we did have, and what a great gift it was, were those letters that he wrote. Because while he was not private with his emotional life, while he was not public with his emotional life, when he expressed it privately to Judy, it was deep and profound and beautiful. And as I say, Bill Hader was so kind enough to, accept the invitation to perform it. He told me that on the first phone call, when his reps called him and said they want you to do this thing, he said, "Well, how could I possibly say no?" And he came in and he captured, while not performing John, he captured the essence of the man. He captured the spirit of the words in such a beautiful way. And that language, those letters, really provided an emotional through line to the entire film.
Yeah, and like a real tunnel into his heart and to his emotions that end up just blooming in so many ways. Judy, RJ brought up the moment, the kind of mid-70s moment. I will take a slightly different tack on that. Talk about comedy throughout our country's history, especially when you're talking satire, which much of John's career was. You're reflecting back what's happening in the world, and there's real social importance in that work, and you can learn a lot about the culture. And that was such a huge part of John that I think audiences maybe need to be reminded of. Do you agree about that sense of commentary that was in his work?
I sure do, and that's one of the reasons I was very pleased when John Batzik brought RJ on, because I felt that way, that he reflects our culture as well as catapulted it in some way.
Yeah.
And sort of the promise, the hope, the talent, the strength, the energy, the youth, and then he just destroyed himself, spun out of control. And in that regard, the cautionary tale is there. I don't only like that about, I don't want to be the main focus of his life, but I just think it is an important part of it. His early career, which isn't really documented, was very political, cultural jokes, kind of taking Second City from the upper crust kind of Brest-Litovsk jokes, and things that were, very kind of based on education. A lot of it was, you knew certain books and fine music, and you could get these references. And it was, it was also Chicago, so it wasn't only that, but he really brought the street into the performances, and he really was the first hippie. Harold Ramis they thought was the first hippie, and he did have long, kind of crazy hair, but he wasn't. He was a latecomer to being a hippie.
Yeah, and also Harold was
Harold was the intellectual.
Yeah, and he describes himself. He liked it safe. He liked it safe. John liked it dangerous. And that was an important dynamic.
I just have to say, the film really reminds me almost in some ways of like Citizen Kane in this fantastic way, because we get to know John through the voices of all of these amazing people and all of the people who knew him. And it's really this phenomenal way of kind of, it's as if you're at a party and people are talking about John. It's really a phenomenal way to kind of to enter us into that world, RJ.
Well, Joe, you've now provided me with my newest tattoo, comparing anything I've done to Citizen Kane. So thank you kindly.
Yeah,
and we can wrap. I think we can wrap it right here. What more could you hope for?
When I did start collecting, the interviews, of which I did some in New York, Chicago, and LA, and at first I did them with various people as I went. But I had that in mind, the Citizen Kane story. John and I went through the college watching Citizen Kane and learning about Orson Welles, and he was definitely a big role model for him, and I couldn't help but think of that.
Yeah.
Well, and again, another gift to have those voices, to have them. At the beginning of the process, I started by talking to people, kind of pre-interviewing a number of people, just in phone calls, and I had lunch with a couple of people who had been in John's life, and I found these conversations to be, I guess I'd say like lost in the hazy fog of memory. People were telling me stories that were the stories they told when they told stories about John all those years later. They weren't immediate. They didn't have the presence and the edge and the rawness that one would want in stories about the life of John Belushi. And then when we found these audio tapes, and I will admit that at that moment I was a little, it was a conundrum. How are we going to get the immediacy that we want? When we listened to the tapes, there it was, because they had been done so, in relatively recent to his life, and that allowed them all to be immediate, all to be raw. And of course, since so many of them were conducted by Judy, they were people were speaking to someone who they knew understood the depth that they would go into. So it was such an important gift, and it required us to do something that I'm now kind of rather committed to in my filmmaking, which is but you don't have to see the interview subject. The words are more than enough, and they allow it to be immersive in and so I'm I'm, as you know, I'm principally a verite filmmaker. I'm not a huge fan of the sit down interview anyway, but here was an excuse to avoid it entirely and to hear the voices, to get the content, but to never leave the moment, the immersive moment, the cinematic moment that you're in, and suddenly be looking at somebody in a chair who's got nothing to do with the story you're telling, or the image. There's a dissociation between the image and the content. Now with these audio tapes, we had a connection. It was similar, and I was definitely inspired. I mentioned Listen to Me, Marlon, what Stephen Riley, the director, did with that film, where it was all Brando's voice without any, obviously, any sit down interviews. So this is an exciting direction, I think, and I'm finding that other filmmakers are doing similar work and also kind of veering away from sit down interviews. It's an exciting, I think, trend in nonfiction storytelling.
It is. It absolutely is. Judy, I want to make sure we're clear. It started about 83 or so is when you started the recordings that for the oral history and which eventually became right, and Samurai Life. Yeah.
Yes, I think the first ones were 83, maybe even late 82. And very much because I too thought, like, people's memories change, and I wanted to get them fresh, and also while they were still a little raw.
Yeah.
I had some very emotional moments with people within some of those interviews. Yeah. My father, for instance.
Yeah. There's family, there's friends, there's coworkers. It's all in there. And you mentioned earlier, Judy, that and this is a question for both of you, because while it may seem like there's actually so much in the film about John's early years, the 69 to sort of 75 years, the Second City, Lemmings show, National Lampoon Radio Hour, those early days. I think too many people sort of assume that the SNL John was the debut of John, or that it was sort of, nothing was documented. But that's important to course correct, isn't it? That there's so much there that is also equally as magical and so important, and as RJ mentioned, bringing together this community of artists, right?
And it was hard to do. I mean, RJ really did that wonderfully, because there isn't a lot of documentation. I mean, there's newspapers and people talk about it, and he managed to make it look like there was probably everything about his early years was in the documentary.
Well, part of what was that's the John that I first knew, because as a teenager, I would listen to the National Lampoon Radio Hour, and this was how I was introduced to John. I didn't necessarily know that it was John, but I recognized his name. And then when so many of those people whose names I recognized from the closing credits of the radio hour showed up on Saturday Night Live, I made the connection. And, there were some kids read Superman, I read National Lampoon, and that was my that was my subscription. Thank goodness my parents allowed it. And but that was what I was turned on to. And kind of my worldview was formed by the Lampoon Radio Hour, early Saturday Night Live. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Judy.
and
Judy, funny, because I kind of have my world shaped by comedy, because all the things he did early on were very timely. It was very about, they were used to read the paper all day long to make up things to do improvs about when they were in Second City, and Lampoon, we always had news stuff. And it's sort of like when John first died, I felt this lack of information. I was like, I didn't have the information anymore.
Wow.
And I realized it was kind of skewed.
Yeah. And Judy and RJ, we'll start with you and then go over to Judy, because the other love story in the film, of course, besides Judy and John's, is John and Dan Aykroyd's, and how that friendship really nurtured both of them, and how it became this sort of sense of, it was a real brotherhood and more, and it was a sense of the two of them kind of discovering the world and discovering each other and discovering themselves through their friendship, right?
It is, and it's so wonderful that Dan describes it as love at first sight, and it's such a key part of course of John's life, of his collaboration, of his struggles. We do have that beautiful footage of the summer of recovery, in Martha's Vineyard, of that. I don't know how it was shot, Judy. I've never asked you, what was that?
Oh, yeah, just
Did you shoot it?
whoever was the most up-to-date camera that day.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing that footage exists, and you see bleach-haired Dan Aykroyd running into the water with John and playing croquet, and John preparing the barbecue. I mean, that friendship, that enviable friendship, that partnership, to find your creative soulmate in that way and to recognize it, and it's legendary, that story, that the night they met, they stayed up all night in the bar talking about things, including the Blues Brothers. John mentioned this idea he had for the Blues Brothers the night he met Dan. It's just beautiful stuff, and you get to see it. And then those photos of the road trips that they would take during the first season of Saturday Night Live, you really and they were such different men. They weren't finding in each other themselves. They were finding in each other their, an inspiration, a kind of a muse, and it's beautiful. It's heartbreaking, but it's mostly beautiful. Yeah. They say again. Sorry, Ginny.
It is. I said they were like-minded in many ways, although they were very different. They shared a lot of similar lives.
Yeah. Well, clearly, and together, what they created, what they were able to do for each other, with each other, and we're blessed to have them.
Yeah. And that friendship is almost like a 70s film in and of itself, albeit in real life, right, Judy? That sense of they could have been like a film made in 1974 about two guys like-minded but very different, and having that, right? Yeah, that friendship.
Yeah, the odd couple.
Yeah, right. That's right. Let's also talk about, something that, and RJ, you and I have talked about this, how it, and the film brings it to light, which is that in fall 1978, the Blues Brothers, Briefcase Full of Blues is the #1 album. SNL is America's most influential show, top-rated show. Animal House is the highest grossing comedy film of all time at that point in 1978. I mean, what an amazing hat trick! What an extraordinary moment in culture that you're sort of watching, and you start to realize that obviously John is the locus of all of it, and it's an extraordinary thing that I don't think has been repeated since, right?
No, and it was not commonplace in any way.
Yeah.
It was a hat trick that I don't think anybody else had ever attempted, let alone triumphed in. And I dare say it was in the days when people watched TV, and it was the days where people had to go out and get a specific record album. It didn't just, you weren't standing still while a tsunami of culture ran over you. You had to choose these things, and you did, and people chose John. I mean, I remember that. I think it was the summer after my 11th grade in high school when Animal House came out. It was all anybody did was put on a toga and go watch Animal House again. You waited in long lines at the theaters, and you got into the movie theater, and there were 700 other people wearing togas and chanting toga, toga, and cheering for John, who was communicating in a new language, right? As we see in the film, very few spoken words, but a transcendent comedy. And this is what I was talking about. He invented things. He invented a way of communicating to his generation in the moment. And it was funny, and it was silly, and it was outsized, and it was preposterous, and it was destructive, but it was truth. And it was truth in that moment. And it's why we loved him so much in that moment, and why, believe me, I can't tell you the passionate response people who shared that moment with John have had to the film, because it meant so much. He was a guide. He was somebody who took us by the hand and tickled us a little bit and shocked us, and as I say, showed us the truth.
Yeah. Judy, the film also makes clear how John's I'll call it quote unquote Hollywood work, because I know early on he sort of resisted going out for even, a TV show spot, a one-time spot, things like that. It's in fact markedly restrained, both in, except for Animal House, obviously, which is its own type of beautiful thing, but both in tone and the output itself. It's though John saw it as a gateway when he gets to 1941, as we see with the letter that's in the film, he was not somebody who sort of dove into Hollywood films with abandon or was looking for things. I mean, 1941, he based that character on family members of his who were in World War II, right? Is that correct?
It was an uncle. Yeah, he had an uncle who actually perished in his pilot. He was a pilot and went down during landing just the week before the war ended in the Pacific. Anyway, so he was happy to do that, to be able to kind of get into that. And we did a little research, went to his uncle's widow and got some information, and he prepared for that much more than he needed to, because they didn't really have the same idea in mind. but anyway,
he's very funny in the film. I'm gonna put that on record right now.
It's funny for Spielberg. Of course, it's a flop, but if you look at it, it's actually beautifully directed. The costumes are great, the setups are great. It's just not very funny. There are moments of funny. It was just misguided. It's sort of funny. It's interesting, and that Spielberg is so good with humor in his films. I think this just says comedies are really hard.
And you don't work any less hard on the ones that somehow don't work. It's every comedy. It's equally, the challenges is great.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at the, it's under half a dozen films in 4 years or so, 5 years, and you're really finding that he was maybe a little bit suspect about a lot of that, and rightfully so, because as was the case with The Joy of Sex, there was sort of this sense of Hollywood didn't necessarily know what to do with John, and John knew that, right, Judy? I mean, he was aware that the Hollywood machine was a different type of beast.
Well, I think probably the bottom line, just he wanted again to do what he was comfortable with, and he was he was working on a storyline he thought could be good, and wanted to do that really, and whatever. He just thought he felt like he's supposed to be one of the top box office draws in Hollywood, and he couldn't do what he wanted. He felt entitled to be able to do what he wanted for a minute.
And he also had real aspirations. He wanted to grow as an actor. Of all the influences and the kind of Bob Newhart and Jonathan Winters, and there were so many brilliant figures that that impacted him as he was coming of age and developing. It was really Brando, I think, who spoke most to him as an artist, and we all have that kind of someone whose work is totemic for us, and for John it was Brando, and he wanted to get on with it, learn more about acting, have more experiences, stretch himself, challenge himself, not be sitting around in a diaper.
As a young man, like Brando was very much an influence, and he liked him just as a person, or from what he could tell from the little TV you'd see him on, and he would watch those interviews and really study him and kind of listen to him in a way in terms of his sense of privacy about his life, because of things Brando had said, and that the idea that as an actor he wanted to be a mystery, a little bit of a mystery. You can think he's the person in the movie, and then he'll give you another one. You can think he's that person. Steiger. I mean, Steiger, Richard Burton. He was really into like a lot of heavy actors, and would memorize scenes that they were doing, and then turn them into scenes. Funny.
Well, that dichotomy, Judy, is one of the reasons why I think obviously John's work has resonated, 45 years later, 40 years later, and that there is this sense of connectivity to him. He had a fearlessness that's evident, of course, in the comedy, but comes from even, the dichotomy between his sort of brawny, big brotherliness and the introspection that as Lorne says, I think at one point, like helped audiences see right into his heart, right? Is that sort of beautiful dichotomy of the introspection and the fearlessness that's where the magic happened, right?
Yeah, I just sort of had an image, a thought that he's kind of like, there's artists who do work that doesn't look very accomplished, so to speak. And some of them can actually do classical drawing beautifully, and some of them can't. John was an artist who could do the classic drawing.
Yeah.
And then he just went and did what he felt like doing.
Yeah. And RJ, to wrap up, the film echoes all of that so beautifully. It's such an important part of it, which is that the form and function that echoes John's essence or his heart. You do such a great job of capturing the man, and capturing anybody in any film is obviously such a challenge and a phenomenal accomplishment. But that must have been the thing that you must have wanted to make sure was being telescoped at all points, was how do we capture the man and not just the work or the anecdotes, right?
Absolutely. The goal was, how do you find the balance? How do you capture the essence? How do you capture the true person? Of course, Judy's archive provided us with so many of the raw materials, but this was a film from moment one that aspired to celebrate the life of John Belushi and ask the question, what was it like when John Belushi was alive? What was his life like? How did he live his life? As you know, though his life ended early and tragically, it's not a focus of the film. It's a fact. All of our lives come to an end. We wanted to look at the essence of the life that he lived and the man that he was. And as always, when we have these opportunities, I want to be able to thank Judy in person for trusting us, for supporting us, for having the patience to wait until we were pretty much done to look at it, for being kind to us when there were things that she might have done differently. We always say everybody would make their own films in their own ways, but Judy, she gave us the gift of trust, and that's love, and we're so grateful to her. All of us who worked on the film, we felt supported from moment one. Our friends at Showtime, the same thing. Vinny Malhotra and David Nevins were so incredibly supportive of this film, and just were like, carry on, do your thing. We were really well supported in the making of this, and that's what a movie like this needs.
Yeah.
Thank you, RJ, and my trust was well rewarded. I appreciate it, and I thank you for your honesty in telling the story.
Judy, what surprised you the most about the film? I guess in the first time that you saw it, just to put a point on that. What surprised you?
I think it's so different, I think, for me to watch it, than anyone, and likewise with other documentary. There's always someone who's so close that it is, I focus on weird things. I get concerned about other people, and I was worried about, and seeing the animation was odd at first. I kind of couldn't. It's just weird to see yourself and others, and so I So
you didn't realize that.
I felt it was good. I felt it was good I thought it was great for what I'd hoped for. I thought it was a telling portrait of him, and fairly balanced, and like 98% accurate. That's very good.
I think
we'll take it.
I think the animated teenage John and Judy, by the way, is adorable. I think
that's what I was going to say. Judy didn't realize that she was an animation when she was a teenager.
I actually didn't realize when you kept saying animation. I thought you were just referring to like segue things or something. And not even like cartoony characters. I was thinking of animation, like maybe of something. I don't know what I thought.
No, the two of you guys.
So I was really wrong.
The two of you guys.
We kept waiting for the animation. I'm like, what animation?
and RJ, how about you? What surprised you in terms of, as you heard everything, as you read, as you got the interviews together, as it compiled, what surprised you the most? Or one of the things?
I've mentioned it. It was that John was a visionary. We think of him as Bluto. We think of him as we think of the Blues Brothers. We think of the great performances on Saturday Night Live. His Liz Taylor remains to this day one of the, I think, most remarkable sketch comedy moments. We think of all these individual things, but we don't realize that they were part of a singular whole. This man was a visionary. He was the director. He was the one that gathered them all. They all came to New York to work with John. And he's recognized. Harold Ramis in this film provides such a incredibly valuable kind of narrative perspective. But he says at one point, he's talking about John and Judy and how they would gather everyone. It was kind of this, it was also a family. And he said, and it was in those moments that we all thought, wow, maybe we're as good at this as we like to be, as good as this as we think we will be. And John saw that in everyone. He saw that potential, and look at who he was seeing at such an early age. Look at the people he identified and brought together and changed the world through his work, changed the culture, so much so that it resonates to this moment. They're still performing Saturday Night Live, and believe me, if there was no original Not Ready for Primetime players, they wouldn't be performing Saturday Night Live every Saturday night on your TV set. It is resonating from those first seasons, and John is as much a reason why as anybody else.
Yeah, it's so phenomenal to spend those 2 hours in John's life with John and with the people who knew him and loved him through this phenomenal film. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this panel for the International Documentary Association's Emmy Award Spotlight Series. Thank you to Showtime, and most especially thank you to RJ Cutler and Judy Belushi-Pisano for speaking to us about the documentary Belushi. Congratulations again. Thank you very much, both of you, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks
Bye.
so much.